Testing, testing.
As a rule, Mr. Nomura, Mr. Hanoka would come to see me at the office that I had out at the War Ministry building, and they would usually, whenever they wanted anything, would come to see me fairly early. So one morning, they came to me and told me that Senator Lemay was very, very sick. They had told me before that he was sick. But he was very sick, and they wondered if they could get any sulfur to him. He had a residence up in the mountains about 5 hours out of Tokyo, where all the prominent Japanese had summer homes up in these mountains there, about 5 hours by car out of Tokyo. And if I could get an American doctor to see him and give him some sulfur, I told him that I would see what could be done. Would come back in an hour. Why, I could tell him what I could do. So there had been a replacement doctor that had just arrived from this country and had been assigned to us, and if anything happened to any of our people, why, you call this doctor in. He was a young captain. I don't know how much medical experience he'd had till he got there. But I called him in and told him that there wasn't any way that I could order him to go, but I was going to give him a suggestion that I thought it would be a good thing if he went up and took a look at this man, as he was a very prominent Japanese citizen and was very friendly, as all the Japanese were, as far as I knew, to us. And he said that he wouldn't do it. Well, I said, that's fine. I can't order you up there, but I'm going to again make a suggestion to you that I think it'd be a good thing for you to go, and it would make a better impression on me if you went. So he finally agreed and got a car and a chauffeur to follow these people up to see Senator Lemay and give him whatever drugs we had. The sulfur was very popular then. I didn't even know how it was used, to be honest. But anyway, the next morning he came back to me and said that he'd made this trip and was glad to make the trip, but that Senator Lemay refused to take anything, refused to let him do anything for him, and he said he's going to be dead in a few days. So in 2 or 3 days, these two men came back to me and told me that Senator Lemay had died and asked me to come to his funeral services at a local, I'm not sure whether it was a church or not. It had the appearances of being a church, but I went to where they had a memorial service for him. Now, I'm not sure whether it was the funeral or not. I think the funeral had taken place maybe a day before, but I went to this memorial service for him, and I remember that all around what I would call the hearth of a fireplace, there were a little bit of plates, all having bits of food on these plates. And I tried to follow the best I could, it was all in Japanese, what the leader was saying. And this was food that they were storing up for him so he would have food in the hereafter. And that was the only Japanese funeral that I went to, but it was a very interesting situation, and his family and the great big organization that he had were very appreciative of an American attending the funeral. I remember that. I have to get all these dates in my mind, see. I have to kind of go by Christmases. In Christmas, 43, I was in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Christmas of 44, I was in Tinian. Christmas of 45, I was in Tokyo. And I haven't been able to figure where I was in Christmas of 46. I was hoping I'd be back in this country, but I'm not sure. I had some sort of records. I'm going to try to find them now and I get Betty to try to look for them, see if I can find them.
Well, if you stayed there 3 years, though.
No, see, I'd come back to this country, and I might have been back in this country at Christmas time. See,
I was wondering if
I
you
had an office in the Pentagon, as well as having an office in Tokyo.
Oh, I see. So you didn't just stay over there for the 3 years.
No. I made 3 trips to China, and I came back to this country several times on official business. And I was trying to see whether I came back on 46, but I remember the Christmases that I've just outlined to you well. I remember those.
Well, how close were you with MacArthur when you were there? Did you see him every day, or did you?
Well, I'd see him whenever he would send for me if there was anything particular that they wanted done. I'd say the whole time I was there, I didn't have over 5 or 6 personal instructions from him, but I had those, and as I said yesterday, he had the whole top of the Daiichi building, where his office was on the 7th floor of the Daiichi building, and whenever I asked to come down there, I never knew whether I was supposed to sit or whether I was to pace up and down the floor with him when he was talking.
Did a lot of pacing when he was talking?
Up and down the floor regular, all the time. So I never knew what I was to do. And but I had a very interesting experience with him, and I appreciate the opportunities that he gave me to be of service and help.
Mm-hmm. Well, did you know his wife here in Tennessee before that?
Yeah. I think that was the reason. Of course, a lot of other people's names had been offered to him, and he turned them all down and came to me, and his family had known me, and he knew of me there, and her name was Faircloth from Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Her name was Jean. She couldn't have been nicer. And I'll tell you one other thing, then we'll quit for today. On Christmas of 1945, I went down for breakfast at the Imperial Hotel. Of course, the breakfast, all of our meals were prepared by Japanese with American food. We eaten our own food because we didn't eat any Japanese food, and I don't like Japanese food anyway, so it wasn't any temptation on my part to eat anything. But I sat down there and just started eating, and General Hugh Morgan, who was Hugh Morgan from here in Nashville, head of Vanderbilt University Hospital, and I knew his family, came in and sat down with me. I said, "What in the world are you doing here?" He said, "What are you doing here?" I said, "I work here." But he said, "I'm out here on temporary duty. I'm inspecting St. Luke's Hospital because we're going to put U.S. troops into St. Louis Hospital that are sick." And said, "I have to inspect him." And he insisted. He said, "I have an appointment with Gene at 5 o'clock this afternoon, and I want you to go with me." I said, I'll call him by his first name. I said, "Hugh, I can't do that." I said, "I'm out here working, and I can't go out. I don't want to impose upon them in any way." So I had felt, but this was really confirmed in my mind. I declined to go with him, but the next morning we had breakfast together the day after Christmas. Of course, he was going to go down and make his inspection, then was going to go back to this country. And I was eating breakfast when I was paged, and it was a colonel whose name I've now forgotten. I can see his face, who really, well, he was one of General MacArthur's aides, but he was out at the embassy all the time with Miss MacArthur. And he called me and said, "Mrs. MacArthur wants you here at 5 o'clock this afternoon." He didn't say wants you, but invites you here to be here at 5 o'clock this afternoon to have tea with her. So when I got there, she said, "Why on earth didn't you tell me that you were here?" I said, "Well, I'm just out here working, and I didn't want to impose upon anybody to do anything." She said, "Well, I'm just delighted you're here." Then the fact that I met her, I know good and well then that she had me put on every social list. And that took the Americans, this was December, and in February things opened up. In March, everybody began to entertain. And I knew that I was I was on these lists, and I felt like that she had passed the word that I was to be invited, regardless of rank. I was invited to all the parties that took place, and every government were given parties, and so for reasons I think it was entirely due to her, I was on the social list. And this is about the Frenchman that the Marshal of France that I like very much, I'm very sure that I'd never been on the Marshal's list if it hadn't been for Jean. But I think that way. But she was there, very active. Her son was there, and she was having him taught piano lessons. I remember that. But I would see her maybe once or twice a month. But I'd only see the general whenever he sent for me to do something.
Well, was he at the social functions too?
He never went except one social function that I remember. No. It was a funny situation. These social functions, the head of every section was never there until the general left for the day. And the minute the general left for the day, the switchboard operator immediately plugged in all of the generals who, she would say, the general is gone for the day. That meant they could leave their office and go down to where these parties were. So you knew exactly what time he left. He would usually come down around 7 o'clock at night and would wake 10 or 11, however late he wanted to wake. But everybody had to keep a staff officer in their section, and most of the chiefs stayed until he went home and they said the general has gone for the day. I remember that well. And then because they all would come into these, but if you see a wife, a vacant chair. You see another wife, vacant. The wives began coming over there, and then you see a vacant chair, and then they would be filled up. The general is gone for the day.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, would you like to stop now?
Yeah, I think I'll try to think of something else.
Testing 1, 2, 3. All right, I've got it going.
My day usually started off about 8 o'clock in the morning, and there would be two people who I could expect to see every morning. One was the Chinese chief prosecutor, who was a Harvard graduate and a very nice person. Or sometimes, it had no bearing on this case whatsoever, somebody from Vietnam would come in, some little person from Vietnam. Now, why he would come in, I don't remember, but sometimes my day would start off with hearing something from him, as well as hearing every morning, I would say, from the Chinese, who had always some problem of some sort. This chief prosecutor and his chief assistant and myself became very friendly, and I knew him well enough to expect him every morning, and I could kid him. So one morning, the chief prosecutor came in, and I asked him in my best English what his problem was for that day. And his problem was this. He stated, and I remember the conversation well, that some members of his delegation, and he had about 400 Chinese in Tokyo, for reasons unknown to me, thought it would be a good thing if they had Henry Puyi to testify. It took me a minute or two to understand and remember who Henry Puyi was, because he had previously meant nothing in my life. They asked, would I please make arrangements to get him brought to Tokyo, and they had no idea who had him or where he was, so he could testify, but they wanted to interview him extensively before he testified. So I took a guess and said that I would talk to the Russians, who I felt very sure had him. So I called the chief Russian delegate, whose name will come to me in just a minute, but he was the Russian that had just left the United Nations conference, where the United Nations had been established, to come out to Japan. The Russians sent him everywhere where the English language was spoken, as they felt that he could interpret any hidden meaning in English language words better than anybody that they had. He was usually either the number 2 or the number 3 person in any Russian delegation. They would have a chief who would be a general. Sometimes this number 2 man would be their intelligence officer, or sometimes this man would be number 2. But if they had a senior intelligence man, this general would be number 3 in their delegation. He asked me when I meet him at his suite of rooms in the Daidi Hotel at 9 o'clock that night, and I told him I'd be glad to. So at 9 o'clock that night, and after a drink or two of vodka, I told him what had been requested of me, and he said that he would send a signal to Moscow later that night and would give me Moscow's answer in 48 hours, and would I come back in 48 hours. So in 48 hours, I came back. We had another round of vodka, and he said that the Russian powers that be had agreed that Henry Puyi could come to Tokyo if I would give my word of honor as an American Army officer that he would not be detained, but after the various different delegations were through with him, he would be returned to the Russians. I told him before I could give my word of honor about having him returned, I had to find out if anybody had any designs on keeping him there, because I wasn't going to be in a position of somebody wanting to keep him there and me saying that I'd be sure to turn him back over to the Russians, and I wanted permission of everybody before I did that. So I called Courtney Whitney the next day and went down to see him, and Courtney Whitney said, call him in 30 minutes. And I called him in 30 minutes, and he said it was okay to give my word of honor as an American Army officer that he would be returned. And that meant that General MacArthur didn't have any designs on keeping him in Japan, and he'd be the only person who could keep him in Japan. So I went back to the Daidi Hotel that night and said that I could give my word of honor as an American Army officer, and I'd be responsible for him while he was in Japan. So we worked out tentatively 2 things. First of all, he would stay at the Russian embassy, and he would be picked up in the morning by representatives of my representatives of my troops, and we would deliver him back in the evening back to the Russian embassy. But he would spend each night at the Russian embassy. Then we worked out, and I had to get hold of the people out at the 5th Air Force headquarters, which then now had another name. I think it's then called, at this time, Far Eastern Air Force. But anyway, I got that general and then got an operations officer, and we agreed upon the approach into the Tokyo area. The airfield that they wanted to use was about 20 or 30 miles out of Tokyo. So we worked out the airfield. We worked out at what altitude we would have planes that would meet the plane or planes bringing Henry Puyi in, and we would work out the call signals that they give, and we would give them the headings that we wanted those planes to use, and we would send planes that would escort them in. That was worked out. So the time finally came, and we agreed upon a date about 2 weeks in advance as to when he would be brought in to Japan by Russian planes, and our planes would meet him. It's the best of my recollection is about 10,000 feet and about 5 or 6 miles out of the perimeter of that immediate airspace around the airport, and would escort them into where he would land at this airport. So I called a friend of mine and said I'd like to have 5 great big sergeants, if possible, from Tennessee, but I wanted some 6-foot sergeants to go with a 6-foot civilian that I had by the name of Joe Williams, and he later became the first head of the Tennessee Highway Patrol, but had him out there in Japan, and I knew that he would be loyal. So in a few days, 5 great big sergeants came up to report to me, and I had Joe Williams, and I told these sergeants that they would remain on the 8th Army payroll, but they would be detached and would be living up here in Tokyo. The 8th Army headquarters was in Yokohama. So I told them, without giving them the name, that I was going to be responsible to see that a very, very important person was going to be a witness, and he was going to be coming. I didn't give them the date, and I wanted them to make whatever arrangements they wanted to among themselves at how it was going to be one person, preferably two persons, on guard all the time, as I didn't have any idea of letting this man be captured or taken by Chinese or anybody else who had any designs on him, because I had to deliver him back to the Russians. So we worked out the details of the escort, and I had them moved up to Tokyo in an army billet there. So the day came, and I took them to the airport and told them who they were going to guard. And in a few minutes, we began to hear our planes talking to the Russian plane, and the Russian plane came in, and they had their guards. The pictures of their guards I have here with me to show to you. And I forget the names of the 5 sergeants. I could look it up. But Joe Williams was head of it. And we met Henry Puyi at the airport, and I introduced myself to him. And the Russians were there also, and they took him right to the Russian embassy. But these men saw him. So the next morning, I took Joe Williams and one other sergeant out to the Russian embassy, and we picked up Henry Puyi. I'll never forget going through the gates at the Russian embassies. The Russians would present arms, with each one of them carrying machine guns. Now, I wondered how heavy those machine guns were when they presented arms. So we had him in Japan for about 6 months, and most of the countries interviewed him and had contact with him. We didn't have any problem or trouble. He ate lunch out at the War Ministry building with our people, and the Russians gave him breakfast, and I guess dinner at night. But he was completely harmless, very appreciative of the attention that he received and the protection that he received, because he was scared to death of the Chinese. And I told him I didn't have any problem worrying about the Chinese or anybody else, because he was in good hands, because our people were with him all the time, except when he was with the Russian embassy at night. So the day that he was to leave, I tried to have lunch with him maybe once a week, just because I felt sorry for him. But the day that he left, I went and told him goodbye, that he was leaving. And he thanked me and said I had been the nicest captor that he'd ever had, and wanted to thank me. But said he'd been in captivity since he'd been 2 years old, and this is the nicest he'd ever been treated.
Testing, 1, 2, 3. Testing, 1, 2, 3. Testing, 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 testing. All right. One thing I wanted to ask you, we ended our conversation the other day on the subject of, we were still talking about Puyi, and you said that you had had lunch with him about once a week.
That's correct.
And when you were with him, what did you talk about with him?
Well, that's a very difficult thing for me to sit up here now and say exactly what I talked with him about. But as a rule, what we talked about was the news of the world, or what I would hear on radio or something of news of the world. And he had a radio, I'm very sure, available to him in the Russian embassy where he was listening. I have no idea what he was listening to. But as a rule, it was a very general talk about what was taking place throughout the world and how he was being treated and when did he expect to be able to finish and so forth of that kind. There was nothing in it to amount to anything.
Did he talk about the trials at all, or what, his testimony?
I don't think we discussed it very much. I don't remember any specific thing of any real importance. If it was, I think I would have remembered it. But as of right this minute, I can think of it and let you know if I come up with anything that we talked about of any substance. But right now, I don't think it was anything except the day-to-day was taking place in the world. And he wondered when they'd be finished with him and when he could go and what was going to happen to him when he left. He had no idea where he was going. He thought he was going back to China. but he wasn't placed with him.
Where did he go? Do you remember where he went
I
after?
think he went to China. I have no way of actually knowing, but I think he went to China because I heard that he was working in a garden in China somewhere under Russian supervision.
Well,
That's what
I
heard.
I just wanted to follow through on that. Let me see now. I'm gonna put it on. What happened? Testing. What happened to the Americans who were prisoners in Japan, and also to the Japanese prisoners?
Well, the American prisoners were immediately turned loose, and they were sent back to this country, either in hospital ships or regular GI transportation if they were well enough to travel without being in a hospital ship. But they were immediately sent back to a base hospital. If they had to stop in Hawaii, why they stopped there and were tended to there. But most of them, as far as I know, went directly back to the States. The Japanese had moved most of the people from the Philippines and various other prisons to the mainland of Japan. Now, the British prisoners were primarily all in Singapore, Hong Kong, Shanghai, and they were sent right back to Great Britain or Australia, New Zealand, wherever they came from. Now, the Japanese prisoners, as far as I know, were turned loose, with the exception of those that they thought were going to be indicted for some act against the Americans who had been hurt or damaged in prisoners of war, being prisoners of war, and they were retained in various different compounds, I guess you would call it. They were in betwixt a Japanese prison and one of our prisons, so they were available and probably were not released until after they had been examined and either tried or turned loose.
All right. Let me see what else I have. When the treaty was not the treaty, but when the Japanese surrender took place on the Missouri, I remember seeing the Japanese in formal dress, and the Americans were not. Now, was that the idea of the Japanese, or did MacArthur insist on that?
I have no way of knowing what the real facts were, but MacArthur always insisted on all of the Americans being informally dressed. There are very, very few occasions when any American was fully dressed, and no ribbons or decorations were worn by any of the U.S. Army officers or the enlisted personnel. Now, the French, when they came in, and the Dutch, when they came in, they had received certain ribbons and medals from their country, and they wore theirs, but the Americans did not wear any medals or any ribbons. And most of the time, the collars were all unbuttoned, except in cold weather.
But the Japanese were really dressed in formal dress.
For any formal occasion, the Japanese were dressed, but the Americans were never dressed, formally dressed.
Well, now, we were talking about the geisha houses the other day, and I asked you something about if enlisted people ever were able to go there, and you explained it to me, but I wish you'd tell me again, and then tell me what the GIs did for their entertainment.
Well, there were a good many. To answer your question, let's take it up one at a time. For GI entertainment, there were several Japanese theaters that were putting on Japanese shows. And American GI or British GI could just walk into it without a ticket or paying anything whatsoever and just take a seat and listen to it or see it as long as he wanted to do it. Then the Americans sent over certain plays that were put on, and one play that I can remember going to see was Hell's the Poppin', and that was put on by a formal cast that came out from the United States, and they played in Tokyo, and they played in Kyoto, and I'm not sure, but I think they played probably in Yokohama, but there was always some sort of play being sent out from the States that was sponsored by, I guess you would call it the USO or something of that kind, and of course those plays were all free. and you could go listen to those or see them or whatever you wanted to do. They were pretty well advertised when they would be able to be there. Now, as far as I know, not a Japanese that I ever saw ever went to a GI play. I don't know whether they were not allowed there, but they just didn't go. Then the Japanese had their own movies, which they could attend, and they had to pay, of course, a fee to attend to their movies. I don't remember any operas or anything of that kind, to where there was any expensive things that Japanese would have to pay off. But the Americans, especially the GIs, didn't pay for any kind of entertainment.
Well, were they able to go out to eat, or were there places where they could go and dance, or any other kind of place where they could sleep with girls?
Okay, there were plenty eating places, Japanese, that were on limits. There were some Japanese places that were off limits that they were not allowed to go to for various different reasons. Japanese places where they could go get beer, which they had to pay for, and they also had these automatic musical machines that they could play, and they were playing American records there, and they could dance there, and they'd pick up these Japanese girls and dance with them. But there was that kind of entertainment was available every night in Tokyo, and I feel sure in every larger city in Japan was available to GIs, but they would cost them money to pick up a Japanese and feed that Japanese. Most places did not charge an American GI money for a meal or beer. Some of them did if they kept on drinking. Of course, they did.
Well, let's see. Have 1, 2, 3. See what else I have in the way of questions here.
Starting in the latter part of April and in May of 1946, the various countries had begun to open up their embassies, and all of them were either giving parties in their embassy if it had finished being repaired, or were giving parties at various different hotels. And there were not any Japanese invited to those parties by the foreign countries. I have in mind the French party on July the 14th, 1946, was the first big party that I remember. But the French gave a very large party at the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo, and I presume they had parties in other main cities in Japan. But they had special planes from France to bring over wine and to bring over French hors d'oeuvres that were passed around. Of course, that was done without any cost to the people who were asked to these various different parties. But I remember the French dinner of July the 14th, 1946, and then the various other countries began celebrating certain days that they had of historic value to them, and the social life then in Tokyo, that was more familiar with Tokyo than anywhere else, picked up considerable.
Well, I believe that's about all the questions I have about the Japan part of it. I have some questions I want to ask you about what you did, but do you have anything else to tell me now about Japan?
I'm just waiting until I talk with you.
All right. Well, later on we can get to some more. But after you left the service, what did you do after that when you got out of the service? What kind of work did you do?
I guess for overworked word, I came back here and got some property and began trying to sell certain properties that I had, and I sold some of those. And primarily, I was engaged in, I guess, for overworked word of the real estate business.
Oh, yes. Well, and did you stay in the real estate business then? Are you still in the real estate business? Slightly,
but mostly, I guess you almost put me in the category of being retired.
Well, you're entitled to it. Now, as you look back on the war and all that took place, what do you think that the United States could have done better during the war or afterward, say during the time that you were in Japan?
Well, let's take the last part first. There was a concerted effort on behalf of the Russians, and it was expressed very well by Winston Churchill's speech at Fulton, Missouri, with President Truman, that an iron curtain had dropped down between the Danube and through the Balkans, and was trying to drop it down all through Europe as far as the Danube. The Russians were determined, in my opinion, to try to have communism throughout the world. And Stalin, I think much to President Roosevelt's surprise, began violating the agreements that he had made with President Roosevelt and Mr. Churchill at the end of December of 1944. He began to violate those agreements as fast as they were made, because he went into Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, and hadn't gotten that far in Poland, but began making communist countries out of them. I think that they were determined to make a communist country out of Japan. They had Northern Korea, and beginning in 46 and getting into 40, China was rapidly becoming a communist country under the control and domination of the Russians. And I think they began spending money to be able to employ certain Chinese to see that China became communist. And I think they made every effort humanly possible to get Japan to become a communist country. I don't know of any money that they spent in purchasing anything, but they put tremendous pressure to control certain areas, and MacArthur was always 1 or 2 steps ahead of them and prevented them from putting any troops. Under the original agreement, the Russians thought they had the authority to take over and administer a fourth of Japan like they had done in Germany. But MacArthur had most of these areas that they wanted already occupied by American forces before they came over. And I don't think the Russians, and certainly we didn't want to have a pitched battle with the Russians. So, to the best of my recollection, with the exception of administrative people in connection with the trials that they were interested in of the Japanese, why, I don't remember ever seeing any Russian soldiers as you did British soldiers, but primarily American soldiers. There were a few, very few, soldiers from the various other countries that served. Primarily, Japan was to be occupied by 11 countries, but 4 countries was to do the administration of Japan. Those 4 countries were China, who took the place of France in the European situation, which was the one in Japan was to be exactly like the European. And you had, of course, the U.S. Then you had the Russians, who were occupying whatever part of Europe they wanted to occupy. They came over, wanted to occupy a fourth of Japan. But Japan was occupied first by the United States, second by Chinese, third by a combination of British, Canadian, Australian, supposedly Indian, but the Indians never had any troops or anything in there. They just had a delegation. And the Philippines to a certain extent. But you had the 4 powers with the right to occupy Japan, but Russia never had any part of the occupation of Japan.
All right, now that's all right. You had referred to that. You had mentioned that at the beginning, way back, one of the first day we talked.
But I can doctor that up and try to get that loop better shape.
Well, that's fine. But what do you think the United States could have done? Speaking of the war in general, to make the war, well, just to have the results different and maybe better. I don't know.
Well, I don't know what you mean by different. Japan was conquered by two things. One, the U.S. troops throwing them out of New Guinea, throwing them out of the Philippines, helping throw them out of Singapore, and helping throw them out of China, but completely throwing the Japanese out of Guam, Tinian, Saipan, then went on into Iwo, took Iwo after very hard fighting, and then took Okinawa after hard fighting. So I don't know how you could have changed this, because the Japanese were telling, or the Japanese officials were telling the local Japanese that they were winning the war and just to stay with them, and that they would finally conquer everybody. And they had the Japanese public convinced that they were winning the war up until a very short time before the actual defeat took place, in my opinion. Now, I think as fast as the Americans got the equipment and the men within fighting range of Japan, which I have reference to now, the 20th Air Force, where they could bomb Japan from bases in U.S.-held soil, that it was a very, very difficult situation, because the Japanese had taken over all of the Pacific and almost down to the entrance of Australia. And they had taken the...
Just hold on a minute. I have to turn over the cassette. All right, now can you remember where you were?
Japan had conquered and taken over all of the islands, and most of all of the coast of China, went on down into Indochina and into the Malay Peninsula. All had been conquered by the Japanese. So we had to start out in Australia and work our way back up with troops to be able to retake some of the islands. The British came out and helped on the coast of China. The China forces, as far as I could see, were never too helpful, either in combat in China or along the coastal cities. So the thing fell entirely upon the Americans first, and then the British, and the British colonies second, to be able to take these islands back, including the Philippines, from us. So we worked our way by island hopping from Australia up to, I guess the furthermost we were ever was Iwo and Okinawa, before we went in, after the peace treaty had been negotiated, to take over the mainland of Japan. And MacArthur was very smart in the way that he handled the administration of Japan. And he walked a very tight rope to keep the Russians out, and was able to use, as I said before, the emperor, and made Japan, certainly for the time being, and certainly the reconstruction of Japan was financed entirely by the U.S. I don't remember any Russian money being poured into Japan. England and France had very little, and that money of England and France was going into various different places in China, nothing in Japan that I remember.
Oh, I do remember. Testing. Okay.
The international prosecution.
I'll hold this one. Let me get closer to you. All right, fine.
The International Prosecution Section of the Far East was organized for the purpose of trying the major Japanese war crimes by people committed. These crimes were basically policy crimes of the Japanese government that were being tried. The prosecutors were to be from 11 countries that had been at war with Japan. So the first order of business was to locate where the trial should be held. should be held, H-E-L-D, period. Some of the people from the Department of Justice who were being transferred to the International Prosecution Section, but still being paid by the Department of Justice, wanted to have the trial in Tokyo, as that's where the first offense against the United States was committed. But the majority, and I think that the orders read for it to be held in Tokyo, decided that it would be held in Tokyo. So the basic plans were that each country should send in a prosecutor and whatever assistance that each country thought that they should have there to help their chief prosecutor, and each country was to send in a judge. Later, after a flood of lawyers from around the world, it was decided that each country, each defendant, rather, of the 22 defendants, would have an American attorney as well as many Japanese attorneys that he could pay. The United States government paid for the American defense attorneys, and the local Japanese paid for any defense that they each had. So it started off with the prosecution section of the Americans being in Tokyo first, and then over a comparatively short period of time, but it did run into a couple of months, each country had a prosecutor, and that prosecutor had as many assistants as he felt he should have, or that his country was willing to support. The American government did not support any of the prosecutors except of the American section. So it was divided into 11 countries. For example, the Chinese had approximately 400 in their delegation, while France had maybe 12 or 13 to start off with, and then it dwindled down to 5 or 6. I don't think India had at any time over 2 or 3 in their prosecution section. The next people to come in were, each country began to send in a judge, and that judge would usually bring with him some assistance wherever he was holding court in his local country. Then the International Prosecution Section was flooded with lawyers over the world that the Americans should furnish each defendant, the 22 defendants, with an American attorney, as I stated a minute ago. So again, there was a delay, and each defendant then had an American defendant as his American attorney representing him, as he was a defendant. You asked specifically about certain things, what my job was. Well, I think there's a kind of an overworked word in American language, coordinator. I guess to start off with, I had to make the physical arrangements through our American, I guess you would call it command, for a place for our people, the Americans first, to live, and then we had to furnish, to begin with, a place for each one of the 11 nations to have their prosecutors stay and live. This was done. Then we had to have a building where the trial would be held, and it took several months of work, and I found a building that had to be redone over, and our Corps of Engineers did the building over to the specifications that we thought you would have to have, namely a courtroom and a room where an audience could be heard and seen, because there was an audience, people wanted to see the trials each day. Then there had to be an office set up in that building for the defense, where they could have offices. So then the trial now is set to be held. There was not any communication between any part of the prosecution of any country with the American defense lawyers who had been sent there, because they thought that would be unethical. So there was very little, as far as I knew, no conversation, socially or otherwise, between the American defense lawyers and the prosecution. you have to bear in mind now that the prosecution was of 11 different countries. We had in the American section approximately, I would say, 60 people there all time. This did not include the stenographers that were brought out, and we had various secretaries, and each country usually had a prosecutor, his assistant, and maybe one or two more assistants, and then they would have whatever secretaries they needed, and translators. Most of the people could speak English language, but as this had to be very accurate, a lot of them brought along paid interpreters. So the trials were ready to start, and they began to start. But it moved a whole lot slower than the American government had ever anticipated. The Americans, when we first went there, thought this would all be done within a period of 6 months. But as usual, these things lasted much longer because the defense was arguing every point, and these trials lasted approximately 3 years. So it's very difficult to say what any one particular person did. This section was headed, the American section was headed by Mr. Joseph B. Keenan, who had been a former Assistant Attorney General under President Roosevelt and President Truman, and President Truman appointed him as head of the section. His chief assistant was Carlisle Higgins of North Carolina. After Mr. Higgins left the International Prosecution Section, he returned to North Carolina and was on the Supreme Court there for 20 years, longer than anybody had ever served on the North Carolina Supreme Court. I think of that as just the type of assistance that Mr. Keenan had. So there was each country had, as well as a prosecutor, they had each criminal, as well as having an American prosecutor, had an American defense lawyer. The judges were from the 11 different countries, and the Chief Justice was Sir William Webb, who had formerly been the Chief Justice of the Queensland Australian Supreme Court. He had, and each one of these justices had several assistants. So it began to be quite an organization that filled up all of the working space that we could acquire and had to continually acquire, as well as having a space because General MacArthur wanted the Japanese people, and as many of them as possible, to see the trials and to see that these people were getting a fair trial, and mainly to hear the evidence of what they had done and the crimes against humanity that these generals had permitted to take place. Now let me stop there and catch my breath, and you might want to ask a question.
You said that one country had as many as 400 in its delegation. What was the duty of some of those 400 people, and did they all attend the trial? Were they all in the audience for the trial?
They were not in the audience of the trial. Most of those people were investigating what was called war crimes against the Chinese. You must remember that the Japanese had committed many atrocities and crimes against the Chinese before we participated in the war. You can think of various different things that you've read about in the papers of the trial of the war battles in China. They went on for a great period of time. I think a lot of those trials and a lot of those crimes that the Chinese were investigating started somewhere in 1936 or 1937. I can see right now that the Marco Polo Bridge right outside of the capital of China was where part of the Chinese war started, and part of it started is what's commonly called the Rape of Nanking. The Chinese were investigating very carefully any complaint that anybody would give that they had been hurt, destroyed, financially ruined, or anything by the Japanese. So they had people, way more than 400, investigating everything that took place between the Japanese and the Chinese that I can think of between 1937 until the end of the war. As a matter of fact, the Chinese insisted that the Americans send inspectors to go along with them, and I made 3 trips into China, to various parts of China, carrying both American investigators and Chinese investigators to investigate any crime that the Chinese said were committed against them or their civilians.
That explains it.
So now the Australians had some 10 or 15. The British only had a very small, I think 4 or 5. The Philippine people had a large delegation. That dwindled down because Americans took over most of their investigation. The Dutch only had a very few investigators there, but the Dutch were very anxious to have everything against them thoroughly investigated, and they had many crimes that had been committed against them, and many of them were proven.
These defendants, they all had individual trials. It wasn't a mass trial.
The trial of the 22 was a mass trial, but you broke it down. You had the 22 defendants, and they had been generals occupying, some of them in China, some of them had been down in the Philippines, some of them had tried to get into Australia, never got there, but some of them had been against the British in Hong Kong, Shanghai, and down in Singapore. Some of them had committed crimes in the Philippines. The French claimed that they'd been hurt at various places. So each country had a grievance, and they investigated that grievance, and based upon that grievance was either proven or not to the satisfaction of Mr. Keenan, who had to sign the complaints. As Americans, he was the chief prosecutor, and some of these places were investigated. He came to the conclusion that nothing uncommon in war had been taken. These were crimes over and above the normal war situation. When I use situation, I mean the combat of war. These were against individuals who were not in combat. Lots of these crimes that they were tried for took place. So it was a combination of civilians of Japanese descent taking advantage of China, taking advantage of the Philippines, taking advantage of the Dutch, and those were the people who were allowed by their local Japanese commanding officer to have those offenses, to get by with having those offenses. They were investigated, and to use an overworked word, they were caught, and basis of that court, they were tried, and they had a right to put on proof to defend themselves that they didn't do this, that, and the other, or they were convicted of being guilty of those crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity, over and above battlefield crimes. Now, have I explained that situation?
Yes, but did this also include military crimes, too?
As far as I can remember, I don't think there were any undue military crimes that they were convicted of. I think most all of these crimes were taking advantage of their situation on local residents or local communities, and that was the main reason that they were convicted, because they killed innocent men, women, and children who were not combatants.
So this does not include the Bataan March, then?
These included the generals who supervised the Bataan March, where American soldiers were brutally treated on this Bataan March, and they were allowed that to take place. Anything in the normal course that they did in war that was correct, where they didn't take advantage of, mutilate somebody or take advantage of, march them till they killed them, why, it was okay. But anything over and above that, they were tried and convicted.
Well, when I asked military, that's what I meant, like the Bataan March and such things.
Have I explained that?
Yes.
I hope I have. But anyway, it's hard for me just to sit here and draw a line that any military person that allowed human beings to be destroyed except in legitimate warfare was found guilty and executed, and later executed.
This is going back to one of our previous sessions. You mentioned that someone was made a cardinal. Do you have a story about that?
Yes. This man's name was Paul Morella, and he had been the apostolic delegate to Australia, and was the apostolic delegate in Japan when Japan got into war with various other countries. And he was enforced to stay in Japan as he was the apostolic delegate there. And
you're not talking about delegate to the trial.
No, this hasn't. This is the apostolic delegate representing the Pope in Japan. At that time, I had no idea of his rank. I thought he was a Monsignor because when I met him, he had an assistant there. Their little house had been completely destroyed, and when I was looking for a building to hold the trials, I ran across a house that had been 3/4 or 7/8 destroyed, and there were two men in clothes of a priest standing out in front of this house. So I stopped, and the first one said that he was the apostolic delegate to Japan. I had no idea what his rank was, and this was his assistant. His assistant was a Belgian. The first man was an Italian. Was the apostolic delegate. And the assistant called him what I thought he was saying was Monsignor or Monsieur. I wasn't Monsieur. I wasn't sure, so I always just called him Father, and I called his assistant Father. We became friends over a period of time, and I had no idea that he was an archbishop, which is high in the Catholic Church, at any time until he left Japan and became the apostolic delegate to France. And in France, his place was 16 Rue Woodrow Wilson in Paris. Has two magnificent homes there, 16 Rue Woodrow Wilson. And I dropped by there to see him, but unfortunately for me, he was on vacation, so I missed him, and I left him a little note that I was glad to see him roughing it in Paris. And got back a little note from him, I don't know where the note is now, saying he was sorry he missed me. He and Pope John the 23rd, I didn't know any of this till later, came from the same mountainous regions of Italy. And Paul Morella was the first person that he named to be a cardinal. And he was made a cardinal in 1957. And I happened to be in Rome sometime in the early 70s. I think he died in 1972. And I went out to the living quarters of the various cardinals, didn't have any difficulty in locating him, and asked him to come down to the hotel and have dinner with me. He and his assistant came down and had dinner, and I always enjoyed his friendship very much.